Welcome to Tradition and Sanity, the reign of novelty and the sins of the times. Why the Novus Ordo is solely modern in content. Part 2. The fairest fruit of a unique civilization. In the first part of this lecture, I spoke about the humility we Catholics should feel in the presence of the cumulative piety of our precursors, and the gratitude we should have for an irreplaceable inheritance that is simultaneously and inseparably doctrinal, catechetical, ascetical, mystical, sacramental, liturgical, and cultural. To see why irreplaceable is an apt word in this connection, consider the sheer monumentality of spiritual and physical resources and the vastitude of time that go into the gestation and maturation of a Christian liturgy. In an important essay, John Lamont entertains a thought experiment proposed by Thomas Pink, namely, would it have made any difference if Paul VI, instead of signing off on ragtag rites of yawnful banality, had instead sourced a dream team of contemplative monks who produced a new rite of eloquent orthodoxy and piercing beauty? Lamont responds that a rite is the fairest fruit of a well-matured civilization, and not something that can be manufactured ad nutum. Summarizing his argument, civilization is built up of components resulting from conscious and deliberate efforts, often successful, to reach the highest level of human attainment, to do so collectively, and to preserve the results. When this occurs, the civilization achieves universal status, which those around it seek to enter into and be a part of. Now, a fully developed civilization will have both religion and philosophy, the one to represent the human race to the cosmos and its ruler, the other to give a rational understanding of the human race, the cosmos, and man's place therein. In Lamont's own words, quote, Christianity was from the first a civilized religion, that is, a religion that used and incorporated the resources of civilization in its belief and practice, and was intended to be suited to civilized people and to be capable of functioning as the religious part of their civilization. This was dictated by the logic of Christian theology. The human nature redeemed by Christ should be shown to reach its highest potential. The divinely revealed message should be expressed with the greatest power and majesty possible. The worship of God should be carried on using the highest forms of human culture. The civilization in which Christianity took being is Hellenistic civilization, which includes Latin and Syriac branches as well as Greek. In the New Testament, we can see that St. Paul and St. Luke both mastered the literary skills of a civilized man, and their works could not have been written without these skills. The works of the Fathers of the Church and the teachings of the ecumenical councils were products and components of a civilization. The councils use philosophical concepts that were developed by Greek philosophy. The character of Christianity as a civilized religion includes its liturgy. The development of Christian liturgy as a form of civilization was hindered by the legal persecution of the religion by the Roman Empire in its first 3 centuries. But after Christianity was legalized by the Emperor Constantine in 313, this development was rapidly undertaken. The traditional Latin Mass is the civilized liturgy produced by Latin Christian civilization, as the Byzantine Rite is the civilized liturgy produced by Greek Christian civilization. The TLM, together with the music and architecture developed to accompany it, is indeed the central part of Latin Christian civilization, which would not exist if these things were removed from it. This gets us partway towards an answer to Professor Pink's question. The idea that a pope could replace the TLM by a new rite composed of texts of even more eloquent orthodoxy and piercing beauty is absurd. The richness of the TLM is the product of an entire civilization and required a civilization to produce it. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote the office for the Feast of Corpus Christi at the behest of Pope Urban IV. This office was a success, but it took one of the greatest saints and doctors of the Church to write the liturgy for a single feast. St. Thomas used an established liturgical structure and established models of prayer and hymnody to produce the office of Corpus Christi. The framework within which he worked was the product of a civilization with millennial roots. An equivalent Christian civilization cannot be produced at will." Unquote. But there is more. Even if a new rite of immense beauty and orthodoxy could be constructed, it cannot compete with, much less outweigh, the standing of a rite that we receive from the past. There are 3 reasons for this. First, loyalty to the traditions of our fathers. Quote, "The TLM was produced by our fathers in the faith, St. Damasus, St. Gregory the Great, and others, building on the liturgical foundations laid by Christ and the apostles. The 4th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, and the implications of belief in the communion of saints require that we follow and keep the religious traditions established by these fathers who built up the Roman Church and from whom the members of the Roman Catholic Church have received the faith. We cannot be dispensed from this obligation. To reject it is to cut ourselves off from communion with these fathers, and hence from the Church." A second reason is that Latin civilization existed at the time of Christ, and that our Lord and the apostles were in contact with it and interacted with it. Latin Christian civilization thus provides us with a direct link to the life and activity of Christ and the apostles, as do the Greek and Syriac civilizations of the other traditional rites of the Church. This connection to the milieu of Christ and the apostles is an invaluable and irreplaceable feature of the traditional Christian rites. A third reason is the fact noted above, which is that the TLM is not of purely human origin. It contains divinely established elements, and these elements include both particular liturgical texts and actions, and broader principles that govern the liturgy as a whole. We do not have sufficient independent knowledge of these divinely established broader principles to design a new rite that would be guaranteed to be governed by them. The only way for us to know that we follow these principles is to adhere to the traditional Latin rite that we actually possess." Unquote. It is reasonable to hold that divine providence directly willed, for the Church's good, the specific families of liturgical rites that developed in the apostolic and post-apostolic periods, and, moreover, willed that they should mature in their broad lines in analogous ways, as all of them in fact did, in spite of being separated by such great distances and linguistic boundaries. Thus, for instance, all rites worshipped eastward or ad orientem. All were chanted with modal melodies. All involved densely hierarchical ceremonial, marked by a ritual and architectural separation between the ordained minister offering sacrifice and the congregation that unites spiritually with him. All featured actions that could not be seen, and words that could not be heard by the people, and so forth. I have gone into all this in detail in my book, Once and Future Roman Rite. But quite apart from lacking certainty about what exactly are the liturgy's divine and apostolic elements, we simply do not have the civilizational resources to create anything that would even come close to the human elements of the TLM. Lamont maintains that traditionalists themselves tend to underestimate the bond that unites the liturgy with civilization, and both with Catholicism itself. Quote, "During the 20th century, the notion of civilization as an ideal was replaced by the ideal of an advanced, quote-unquote, society. An advanced society being one that is strong in science and technology, and in consequence wealthy. This new ideal was understood to require the rejection of the old one. The elements of civilization in Western societies, for example, education in classical languages, art and architecture in classical styles, formation in high literary culture, atrophied, or were deliberately attacked and eradicated. Developments in the Church from the 1950s onwards thoroughly implemented this destruction of civilization with the intent of adhering to the new anti-civilizational model. Traditional religious art and architecture ceased to be commissioned and were physically destroyed as far as possible. It was often secular governments that prevented the coup de grace. The TLM was totally suppressed, and the music developed for it ceased to be performed, at least in a religious context. The Latin language and the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas were removed from clerical formation. The collapse of religious orders and the eradication of the tradition of Latin scholasticism and liturgy in the remnants that remained meant that the scholarly study of Latin Christian philosophy and theology also collapsed. The Novus Ordo is part of this anti-civilizational project. This leaps to the eye when the ritual of Paul VI is examined in the setting of the architecture and music expressly produced for it. Since Catholicism is a civilized religion, destruction of Catholicism and destruction of civilization went together." Unquote. To sum up Lamont, it takes countless individuals, among them not a few geniuses, and many centuries of patient labor to build up a civilization. The matured liturgical rites of Christendom are in part the result and in part the driving force of Catholic civilization in toto. The Roman Rite, like the Byzantine Rite, is the fruit of the Incarnation standing at the crossroads of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. It is the refined liquor that has passed through the distillery of the apostolic and patristic age, the Middle Ages, the Baroque, down to our times. Whatever changes it has seen, the developments in Gaul, for instance, that later returned to Rome with the Romano-Gallican Missal, or the particular feasts added each century by devout pontiffs, such changes have been engrafted into the totality it represents and embodies, while yet the character of the tradition has dominated, has been allowed to dominate, and has been protected in its domination. Liturgical Conservatism and Good Sense. The liturgist Bernard Bott, who eventually went over to the dark side, still had the common sense in 1953 to make this observation about the Roman canon. Quote, "We should be grateful to the people of the Middle Ages for having preserved the canon in its purity and not having allowed their personal effusions or theological ideas to pass into it. One can imagine the complete sham we would have today if each generation had been permitted to remake the canon to the measure of their theological controversies or novel forms of piety. We can only hope for a continuing imitation of the good sense of these people, who had their own theological ideas, but who understood that the canon was not their playground. To their eyes, it was the expression of a venerable tradition, and they felt that it could not be touched without opening the door to every sort of abuse." Unquote. Naturally, what Dom Bernard says about the canon can be said about the entirety of the liturgy. It was, it always will be, the expression of a venerable tradition, the violation of which has opened and will always open the door to every sort of abuse. The testimony of Father Yves Congar in the late 1960s is no less forceful, given that he was no traditionalist. Quote, "The conservative character of the liturgy makes it possible for it to preserve and transmit intact the values whose importance one epoch may have forgotten, but which the next epoch is happy to find intact and preserved so that it can live from them again. Where would we be if this liturgical conservatism had not resisted the late medieval taste for sensory devotions, the 18th century's individualistic, rational, and moralizing imperatives, the 19th century's critique, or the modern period's subjective philosophies? Thanks to the liturgy, everything has been retained and transmitted. Ah, let us not expose ourselves to the reproach 60 years hence, that we squandered and lost the sacred heritage of the Catholic communion as it is deployed in the slow flow of time. Let us keep a healthy awareness that we carry in ourselves only a moment, the tip of the iceberg, in relation to a reality which is beyond us in every way." Unquote. We are reading these words almost 60 years after Congar penned them in 1968, and what he warned against has exactly come to pass. Whatever his other faults and errors may have been, here Congar perfectly expresses the Catholic idea of submission to the totality of tradition as it comes to us, stands before and above us, and measures us. Joseph Shaw argues that this idea, or its rejection, yields quite important consequences. Quote, "We may usefully contrast the pre-modern conception of tradition with a modern one. Liturgists who regard themselves as conservatives as well as progressives often say, in effect, 'I will pass on to the future those parts of what I have been given which I choose.' After a few generations of such choices, subject to changing intellectual fashions, continuity will have worn extremely thin. The pre-modern conception is, 'I will pass on to the future the whole of what I have been given, insofar as it is in my power to do so, both what I understand and appreciate, and also things I do not understand fully, things which offend the aesthetic fashions of my time, and things which touch painfully the favorite sins of my generation.'" Unquote. In Part 3, I will take up the standard line that the Novus Ordo restores ancient elements that were lost over time, and that it is, in fact, more traditional because it resembles more closely certain descriptions given of primitive liturgies. We will discover that it is, on the contrary, radically untraditional and theologically untenable to leapfrog over centuries in quest of a putative pure form, a quest that cannot avoid being arbitrary, political, ideological, and impious. On the Substack, you can find the detailed notes for this article. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.